We are continuing with this bespoke jacket, and we're now going to put the collar on. So the first thing with the collar is to have a pattern that you have drawn. So here's the pattern that I drew, and one thing that I always struggle with is kind of matching this pattern to the garment. So the best thing I can say is to take a piece of scrap, cut this out, and to pin this on a mannequin or on a form, because I've often found if I pin it straight like this and then I pick it up, it tends to scrunch here. Of course, you could just add ease, whatever. Lots of different methods. I like to do it on a mannequin. Then I pin it around here, and then just see what is the shape, because this shape of the collar ends up being stretched out. As you can see here, I cut this shape, and then here with water and heat, we press this out. Here, it's mainly this portion that needs to get stretched. This is on the bias, and it's also, at this point of the garment, so you don't really need a lot of stretch there. Um, but it's really the center back, a little bit here, and then this portion we're not stretching, because this portion must sit, like so with the collar. So we don't need that to stretch forward. This, you see from here, it's more or less straight down like that. So it's really the center back portion that you stretch. And because of that stretching, it's not an exact science of how much broader this will become. And also because we've done a lot of manipulating here through the fitting process, all of that, this neckline, now it should be 1 centimeter seam allowance, you see, it's not exact. So I actually need to figure out my pattern and all of that. But as you know, I'm a bit of a cowboy, so I just go ahead. Also, my clients don't have time for me to figure this out. They want their fashion now. So in any event, once I've done that, I've gone with a piece of scrap, see more or less how long this is. Obviously, you can also just measure that curve, because this is now 1 centimeter seam allowance all the way around. Then I come to this pattern and I just add usually about 2 centimeters, so 4 in total, 2 on the fold, to this pattern piece, just for in case. And you can see here, here's actually the 1 centimeter seam allowance, where it should be, and it's wound up maybe about 1 centimeter below that, just because there was a little bit extra in the pattern. And it's better to be extra because here, I can just cut that off. I can just trim that down. Here, I won't even cut it. I'll just stitch it all the way down there. And then this extra portion here, I'll cut in the shape that I want. So a lot of people do like this. They actually make this much bigger than it needs to be, and then they just trim it according to the fashion. So it's kind of an easy thing to do. I also add here about 1.5 centimeters, so that again, here I can just trim it down. Then I go along the break line and I just stitch a running stitch to keep the break line from stretching out. And then I stretch that portion, so we get this shape. And then pasting this, like I was saying, on a form, on the mannequin, it's better. Baste along here. So you're going to start from the center back, pinning, 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 or you can just baste immediately, it's up to you. And then from here, you want to make sure that this comes in a straight line, your break line, and matches with that break line. See, if I was to force this with the 1 centimeter seam allowance, then the break line of my collar would be out here, and my break line of my jacket would be under here. So this, obviously, if the pattern was perfect, then that wouldn't happen, but you can just sue me for that. Matching up the break line, and then just let that fall where it wants to fall. Then from there, I always fit, because I want to see what the client, how is this working? Is it working with the shoulders? No pinching anywhere, anything like that. So now that I'm happy with that, happy with how it's fitting with the client, I want to just trace out this shape so that I can cut the fabric like this. Obviously, I could trace this directly on the fabric, but this way just gives me a little bit more control of where I'm going to do what. Maybe I should just do this on the fabric actually. So this is a bit wrinkled. I don't think it's such a crime because I'm going to iron now. And yeah, this is the wrong side, and you can see I've got all of this, so I need to make sure I avoid that. I should just cut from this side. Let's cut from this side. Yeah, this is the wrong side. Okay, so place that out there. I suppose the reason for the pattern is that you can get it symmetrical before you cut. But why not live on the edge? Let's see, 16.5. Let's move this one. So this orientation, the warp of the fabric is going this way, cutting along the weft here, and that's the proper way. Personally, I don't really think it's such a crime to twist it that way if that's how the fabric is lying. But the reason why it's better this way is because this portion here, where you need to stretch more, is now on the weft, which has a little bit more stretch. Now this method that I'm doing, it doesn't really need a lot of stretching. Actually, it should require no stretching at all. But some people cut this, again, same shape as this, and then same that I've done here, they just stretch it out. I like doing it like this because this is just kind of what I know. Let's do it like this. I'm going to just trace this. So this is, in a way, based on the commercial patterns that have a seam here. And like I said, that is what I know. So I'm just really sticking with what I know. And, I'm constantly updating. To be honest, it's the first time ever that I'm actually drawing this direct to the fabric. So I'm always figuring out new methods, new ways to go. So do take everything I say with a pinch of salt. Okay, so there it is. So obviously I can't have a seam right there. So the seam needs to move half a centimeter inside. And then I've got a half a centimeter seam allowance. So here I'm going to add a centimeter. Here also adding a centimeter. Now here on the edges, I would add about 2. I'm actually going to do 1.5 this time, because I know from the fitting that this is actually far over, and this is far bigger than I need. So I'm just going to make 1.5, 1 down here, and then here on the back as well. Usually I'd make it about 2, but because I know this is, I have a lot of excess here, just from the fitting, I'm making this 1.5. And obviously I will cut with my usual method, just adding that extra quarter centimeter as I go. Okay, so here we go. Nothing too exciting there. So I'll cut the rest of this out properly now and then hit the iron, obviously. But for now, I need to take this shape. I'm just going to move around here, keeping this as straight as possible. And measure from here. Just seeing a little flaw in the fabric. This on the inside is not going to be. Do I see it this side? Just going to measure from there 14 and 14. This is going to keep me more or less straight. Okay, trace the same shape. This is now 3 centimeters. So here I make it kind of like an edge. I'm going to trim this down. I think because, this is like a difficult section for me. So my solution is just to cut everything a kilometer too big and then trim down as we go. So here, again, there's the exact break line. So we want to shift the seam a centimeter down, and seam allowance is half a centimeter. So actually we shouldn't move this at all. But because an extra, here's the extra half a centimeter, just for in case. Extra centimeter just for in case. And an extra centimeter just for in case. Now this is really going to be very extra, but that's fine. I'm just going to trim it as I go. So yeah, that's how I do my pattern. I'm going to then give this an iron and make sure that it's symmetrical. And then I'll hit the sewing machine from there. Right, so it's been ironed. And then, like I was saying, step 1, symmetrize. That's the word. Because of course this, cut a little bit like a cowboy, some creases in the fabric. So I just want to get all of this nice and symmetrical. I'm just going to notch there, a very small notch, because the seam allowance there is half a centimeter. So the notch is too big. I'm going to struggle stitching that. Okay, yeah, that looks fine. Same here. So this one, this edge here is going to be attached onto the undercollar, the part that's facing onto the neck. And that has to kind of go around the break line into that neck portion. So there I'm going to stretch it a little bit, because that is going to need just a little bit of encouragement to go around. Okay, so I'm not going to show you that stretching. I'm sure you know how it goes. It's just water and heat. And I'll just stretch out just this portion here, because again, this portion here is more or less flat. So it's really this portion here that needs to be stretched out. And just that little bit of the seam allowance. I'm not going to stretch out all the way to here. Just that little portion there, a little bit of a stretch. And then what I'll do is I'll join these two together, right sides together, half a centimeter seam allowance. You can see that stretch there. It's really not a lot. Just a little bit of stretch. So if I lie that portion flat, this portion is stretched here. Remember, this here is actually a little bit on the bias. So this will stretch naturally. but this portion is on the straight, so that you just want to stretch out a little bit. And yeah, I mean, nothing. Oh, I should have marked my center there. Then we'll just join that right sides together, and that little stretch is just going to help it to curve around the break line. So let me stitch this quickly. There you see, because of the stretch here, the top collar ended up being a little bit further than the bottom collar. That's exactly what we were expecting. So that's exactly what we got. I was not expecting to not have a ruler with me, but here we are. So here I just take this and kind of straighten that up. One thing that I did here is I backstitched quite a bit because I am going to trim this. So having a long back stitch is just going to help with that. And then also here in the center where the notch was, I just backstitch there as I'm passing the knot because it's a very small seam allowance, so I don't want it to fray out. And then of course just iron that seam open. Now this actually is just going to chill for a little bit. I'm going to put that to the side and come back to here to this collar. Now this collar is one of those pre-made ones. So it's a bit flimsy. I like to put some fusing here, kind of like medium weight fusing, just around the edges. And then what I'm going to do before I carry on is just trim down by 1/4 centimeter the canvas, just back from the felt. And this is just going to make it look a little bit more fabulous when we stitch it. Of course, if we stitch it and you see a little bit of this felt underneath, see a little bit of that felt underneath, that canvas underneath, no one will die. But if it's just the felt, it just looks a little bit more high fashion. So just on this portion that's going to join into the jacket, I'm just going to trim all of this down. So this collar fabric I actually inherited from another business that closed down. And I'm kind of, scraping the bottom of the barrel now. Maybe got another 5 or so jackets that I can make before I have to start making my own collar, which I'm quite excited for because that is a bit of a better, more well-structured collar. Yeah, this is just the fastest way, of course. Time is money. Okay, let's see. All right, so here, it's easy to do this without the sleeves because then you can just lie flat like this. Now I see that I actually had placed this at 1.5 centimeters, which is actually supposed to be 1 centimeter, but let's go to 1.5. And again, I'm going to do this on the mannequin, just stitching, or I'm just going to pin it along the back, and then from the shoulder, I'm going to make sure that the break line goes straight into that break line. I'll just pin that all, and I'll come back and stitch. So this attachment, it's really not an exact science, and this is why I like to do it on the mannequin, because I'll spot something here that would be difficult to spot on the flat. So see here, I've pinned it around, but now if I continue, even on that 1.5 on the shoulder there, see my break line is now coming out really not where I want it to. So I need to shift the shoulder point a little bit because if I pin it there and then force it back, it's going to create this little bubble over there. So I'm going to then make sure that's lining up nicely with the brake line over there. And then just pin this where it wants to be. So that is creating a little bit of a gather there for me. So let's see. I think that'll be okay. Yeah, that is more or less as I had it previously. So I'm just going to see if that is going to still lie nice. Yeah, that seems okay. I just want to check this one. This one is a little bit shorter than it was. Maybe I'm just going to put a little bit of gather in here, just for the sake of symmetry. And then I don't get a pull here. So that'll shorten that up a little bit. Yeah, and then finishing, let's say 1 centimeter, yeah, a little more than 1 centimeter back. So that should be okay. Now you can see if you look carefully, the collar is down. Kind of has a like a little roll here. Like it actually wants the brake line to be a little bit higher, which I don't really want to do. I'm just going to stretch that out a little bit with my hand so that can then lie nicely on the collar or on the shoulder. Yeah, and I think that's, because you see this one's actually perfect. Creating a little bit of a gather there. So same here, I'm just going to give that a little bit of an extra tug. Now this neck is actually a bit bigger than my client, so do need to be cautious about that sort of thing, you know, making it now fit the mannequin and not my client. But yeah, there we are. So that's all nice and pinned. Let's go back to the flat. That now pinned, I want to go around and just pin it nice and securely. So I'm going to come here and do this by hand, and also then release anything here that I've pinned. Okay, in this case, I actually didn't pin anything, which is fantastic. But you see there, I pinned this portion of the facing. So you can see here what I've done with the facing. It's ironed in there at 1 centimeter, and then the back doesn't have that, so the back will match exactly to the edge. And then here on the front, that 1 centimeter. But we'll get back to that in a moment. Don't stress about it for now. But I just want to make sure that all of these pins are nicely in place, giving me a good guide to where I'm going to stitch. So here it is, you know, it is lower down than it should be, but like I was saying, it's really not a crime. What's important is that the brake line here and this brake line match up very nicely. Here, however, we now want to trim it so it doesn't come past, so it doesn't come past this peak. I'm going to trim it back just like that. I'm going to just continue that trim completely straight. So I'm going to get that out of the way, because here we can't really just stitch extra there. That won't really work. So I'm going to keep that for a second. Yeah, that's fine. This side, same story. Making sure things are nice and secure, and that I haven't caught any of the facing or the lining. Here I know I put some lining, some facing. Yeah, you can see a break line coming into break line. Perfect. Okay, there's just some basting there that I don't need anymore. Okay, so again, tracing off this peak. And I want to see how these two compare. Yeah, more or less. Yeah, and that is going to sit more or less fine. I'll trim the rest of that later when I get to it. For now, I just want to sort this portion out. So yeah, now from the back, I'm going to come with the double. You can, I suppose, do this my machine. For me, it's just easier to do it by hand because it's quite finicky to maneuver this whole thing around the machine and have it all lie neat and flat. Now I just want to make sure whatever I need to be out of the way is out of the way. Because here I'm stitching just the collar to the garment. This facing must be out of the way. So even here, I want to redo that pin. Everyone else is fine. So it's up to you if you want to do a nice herringbone. I like to do just a very plain whip stitch. And I just keep my whip straight on the top, diagonal at the bottom, so that's the best angle for your hand. And I just carry on all the way around. So I won't bore you to watch all of that. I'll get to the other end and then we'll chat. Yeah, there it is, all stitched down with just a very plain whip stitch. So now on the right side, I don't want this portion to end up flapping down, creating bulk. So I want to now go over, do whatever you like. Usually I do a herringbone because I'm on this side anyway. And I just do a herringbone over the top of this just to secure that edge into or upwards so it doesn't end up flapping about. And then, so yeah, I'm going to continue that herringbone, stitching it to the collar. Then here on the back portion, I'm going to line this up, checking where's my seam. It lines up. So the lining is then going to, also with the herringbone being caught, be caught up to the top there. Check where's my seam. So this should match exactly to your shoulder seam. And this portion that's folded under should be 1 centimeter. Now, if it's not exactly 1 centimeter, no one is going to die, but it does help to be as humanly accurate as possible. Yeah, so that's just that. Now we're going to stitch the lining. Okay. So again, I won't bore you, but I am going to do something a little bit interesting with the lining. So I'm going to continue herringbone. When I get to this side, we'll chat again. Yeah, I'm done there with the lining. And at some point, the angle just became too uncomfortable. So I shifted this way and just continued with this, whatever you want to call that stitch. Now, I want to go back to the back side. And I want to stitch along, in a way, the top of my stitches. So let's say like 3/4 up from the edge. I want to just go around and stitch that. So here I'm going to do a back stitch and just run along there. Do this for a couple of reasons. Number one, I feel that there's a lot of weight of the lining here in the back. So all of this is now pulling down, and I feel like here, I want that to be a little bit more secure. And now, it's tough to tell because of this pattern, but you see here, I can see my stitch of lines. So I know exactly where is my stitching on this side. Now, this is going to be an interesting one because you can see here, I've got a 1 centimeter that I need to edge out to catch that. That's going to be interesting. Maybe I'll just pull that around because actually usually this is 1 centimeter. I did this at 1.5 just because I'd actually made this collar far too long. So I was trying to take up some of that seam allowance. But in any event, this is how it goes. Always a bit of a learning process. And I'm just now, yeah, so I'm stitching along there just to give myself on the right side a line that I can work on, that I can line the collar up to when I come to that in a minute. So yeah, I'm just going to finish that up, then come back here and finish stitching that flap down. All right, so all of that is done. Secured that portion up so it's not going to flap about. And now I'm going to go around and stitch this portion of the facing down with a single stitch, very, very tiny, almost like a slip stitch, so that this can be nice and secure in place. So I checked that this is 1 centimeter seam allowance all around. Going through here and just catching just the very edge. You don't want to see the stitch at all. Let's get rid of some of this basting. Yeah, so I'm just going to go around and do that for obviously both sides. Doesn't have to be very strong because this doesn't really bear any weight. It just needs to remain in place. So yeah, let me go and do that. Okay, so here you can see I've stitched that just with tiny, tiny stitches, keeping that in place. Something I forgot to mention is that underneath there, I like to just put a soft fusing so these hairs don't end up sticking out, especially on a dark fabric because this can be quite light. And then you can maybe see a little light portion there. So before we carry on, I just want to shape this a little bit. And as we saw last time, this is bubbling here. And this is also to do with the collar just being a bit long on the shoulder, so it's pushing up there. Just going to take a little bit off the shoulder there. And here, I like to have this a little bit shorter. So it's 3.5 than the peak. So it's going to be 3. And here, I'm just going to really kind of go with my eyes to see what that looks like. I will often cut this a few times, also especially to make sure that the two sides are the same. So on this side, I can check here where I have just over 4.25, just here by the shoulder. So there's 4.25. And here we're doing 3.5. So what I'll do is I'll just put these two edges together and see where the chalk lines match. Then cut it and then check again. Always be checking. So here I just kind of go with my eyes, I make it fashion. And then here at the back, I do like it to be long at the back, but I don't like it to be longer than what's on the shoulder. So that's 4.25. Yeah, and that's 4.25. Perfect. So I can just really kind of smooth that in. here to the back, and then the same this side, smooth it in to the back. And you can see here, because of the roll of the collar, the felt is coming out at the bottom. So I'm just going to trim that all exactly flush. So I've gone and trimmed this down, checked that they're the same, double checked, triple checked, quadruple checked that they're the same. This actually, I'm just going to give another iron quickly, just so that this seam allowance can be open, because that's going to make it easier for me to work on. Okay, so taking this collar, the one thing I always do is just prepare myself emotionally to do this job twice. I'm going to mark the center here as well as I can. And then I'm putting the seam allowance on the inside towards the body and letting the edge of the seam allowance be on the edge of this break line. That's kind of how I do. And at this point, I'm really just looking at specifically the seam. I want that to be, that half a centimeter down from the break line. So the edge of the seam allowance should be exactly on the break line. I'm just going around and stitching that along this break line, trying to keep everything in a curve because that's how it's going to be on the body. Some people do also here do a whip stitch to keep the break line exact. Kind of depends how I feel on the day, if I want to do it or not. Today I've opted not. So just continuing that all the way down. So see here, it needs to, this part of the collar needs to roll over the break line. So that's why we stretch that portion out just a little bit where it joins the seam. So I'm getting here to where I connect now with the lapel, and I'll just stitch. You can see how much extra that is. Look at that. Yeah, this, like I say, it's a challenging job for me. So my solution is to just cut it a kilometer big and then trim it as I go. So checking that that's going to fall nicely into the break line and that this seam is not going to be visible. Then I'll come back underneath here, this under collar portion. So just kind of basting it where it's going to be eventually. When I get to the center, I'll then go from the center to the other side, doing the exact same thing. So I think let me do that. And so here I finished, basting this undercollar portion. And then I check from where it intersects with the facing portion. This needs to be symmetrical. So this one, it's around 5. And this one, unfortunately, looks to be around 3. Four and a half. Is that actually fine? No, this is like 5.5. So, it's just one of those things. Like I said, I always prepare myself to do it twice. So I'm going to undo this, shift it a little bit, and then just redo the whole thing. All right, round 2. So I've just stitched this under collar and check that it's symmetrical. So now from there, I'm going to baste up and kind of keep this as smooth as possible on the collar. I'm going to try and get a nice center line going here. And then I'll come around and baste, just kind of on the side of the fall. Same story, basting along the break line until it joins with the lapel, and then come back a little further out, and just trying to keep this as smooth as possible, letting the fabric fall where it wants to fall. And then here, here I can see where I'm joining in with the lapel, and I want to just keep that as flat as possible. And then coming back. So I'm not going to go on the edge this time. I'm going to come back kind of next to these stitches. Then on this side, I'll do the same. Close to the break line, a little bit back, and then on the edge of the collar, this side. Just baste the whole thing. So there, that's done. Basting done. And then I check this portion. I flip it up against the edge of the collar. And I just measure, they're kind of tip to tip, 5.5. The top just on 5. And it should be the same here. Tip to tip, 5.5 at the top, just on 5. So from here, I'm going to put it back on the mannequin, double check that everything's okay. So here I have it on the mannequin and just checking that everything is folding nicely and not giving me any weird wrinkles anywhere. And that's looking fine. I already looked, especially for wrinkles around here. You can see there's a little bit of a wrinkle there, but that's totally fine. And this is because I stretched that portion out so it folds nicely into the collar. So if I'm all happy with that, we'll go off the mannequin and carry on. So now I'm going to flip this up and mark out where is my actual seam. You could, from here just stay on the garment. Don't have to unpick, but I like to unpick, cut this, and then reattach because I'm extra like that. So I'm just going around marking off where it is that I'm now going to have my edge, my turn up. Nothing too exciting. Just going like this all the way around, and then I'll take this off the mannequin. I'll undo this basting, take the collar off, and take it from there. So now that we're off the mannequin, I'm just going to really kind of solidify this line. This is now really the join line. And what I'll do from there is add a centimeter seam allowance. I also do check, from the edge there to my line, 5.5, edge to my line, 5.5. So this is all looking more or less great. So here I'm going to take a centimeter off. I'm going to add a centimeter seam allowance. And then I am going to cut this. Before I do that, I'm just going to come here and back tack over that portion so when I cut it, it doesn't end up unraveling. And of course, I'll make sure that it's symmetrical once I cut. Here, this portion, I can just kind of go with my eyes straight. With my eyes straight. And you see this one comes kind of to the corner and this one doesn't. So I just want to check here. About 7. This is like 6.5. So I actually want to move this one down a little bit. Let's see from that corner, edge 7. So I want to make that 7. Move my seam allowance a little bit. You know, this thing is very difficult to get symmetrical. You know, if I, well, it kind of comes basically to the point. Okay, so that's fine. So I'm always, trying to make it symmetrical as I go. So I'll back stitch that portion and then cut this out and double check for symmetry. There it is. I've just trimmed that down. And if you look, that is more or less as symmetrical as it can get. I'm just going to mark the center, which is a little bit off center where my original center is, as you can see there. So we'll just be checking that as we go, doing the same basting process and just preparing emotionally to do it twice. I'm going to trim that seam allowance down. And then I'll pop over to the iron and just iron this up at 1 centimeter seam allowance, iron that all, like so. From the iron, so now I'm going to check my center notch, which was one of these hundreds, that one. Have this in the center and matching it onto those lines that I stitched down there. And this time I'm going to do it with pins. Pin this around. And here it will just butt up against this portion of the lapel. Or I guess here we'll call it the facing. And it should be, kind of tight if you do it on flat, but fine if you do it on a curve. It's always tough to work this kind of on the inside like that. You could, of course, if you were a sane person, mark the the shoulder point here, but it should all just kind of lie in smoothly. Yeah. Okay, seems to be going all right so far. Let's check this side. So this being on the round, it does help to kind of be able, because you can shift it, just a little bit like this, and it won't be a drama. On a square, it has to be quite exact, and sometimes bespoke is not all that exact. So the round can help you there. It can also sabotage you, because then you don't have an exact point that you're working for or working towards. But let's see how this all pans out. This is looking okay so far. You can see this, seam line is back of the break line. Let's just see, I actually think that needs to come out just a little bit more. This for me is one of the most complicated jobs. I don't know if someone out there has a better plan to just save me all these tears. And then I can check again. What is this? 5.5. Almost just, no, 5.5. Okay. So that I'm pretty happy with. I'm going to go ahead and baste that. maybe a quarter centimeter from the join line. Use this cotton that was donated to me by an old lady who just had hundreds and hundreds of cottons that she hadn't used. And some of them are really old and brittle, so you can't really use that for garments. I just use it for basting. But it does tend to be extremely twisty. But you know, for sustainability, we do anything. And once I've done that, I'll go ahead with how I originally did the basting, just based kind of um, on the inside of the break line, and then go around again and baste over the break line on the collar, and like get all of the fabric of the collar matched to the canvas collar that's underneath here. So I think let me do that, and we'll continue from there. So you see, I did the same basting as I did before, and again, just double checking on the mannequin that everything is lying nice and smooth, and I'm happy with that. So I'm going to come back to the table and stitch along this join line. So I've got a very small knot ready. I'm using a single thread. It's going to kind of hide that knot underneath there somewhere. Come up more or less here in the middle of the join. And I just want to stitch this from like from the zigzag join where the peak comes. So if this wasn't a peak, it would also just be from this exact point where the undercollar starts. And I'm just going to ladder stitch one end to the other. The tiniest stitches that have ever been stitched in the history of stitching. Obviously, it would have been better for me to wax this first. So I've got a bit of a overlap here. So I'll kind of tug on that. I think I'll probably redo this section. Just so that these two edges can lie nice and flat next to each other. So there's not too much to it. Just a very, very tiny ladder stitch. I'm going to go along until I get to here. Then I'll just do a whip stitch around there and then end with a ladder stitch also on the other side. I'm almost at the end now. I thought I'll just do this last section with a bit of a close-up, just so you can really see what is happening here. And it's just a ladder stitch grabbing the fold on each side and making that stitch as minuscule as possible. Now, as I went, I pulled the basting out because it wasn't holding it, exactly edge to edge, and I didn't want to end up, pulling or putting a bubble anywhere. So I just took that basting out as I went, and obviously now I'll put it back. Let me finish this off, and then there's one more thing I'll do, two more things I'll do before rebasting, and then I'll do the top of the collar and then the edge of the collar. So yeah, here you just got to have patience. and just go tiny stitch, tiny stitch, tiny stitch. The smaller your stitches, the more fabulous and beautiful this is going to be. And also the less chance you have of the under portion sticking out. You know, if it's tight like this, you can't really, you know, spread that out. But if it's a looser stitch, that could spread out over time, and then you'd see the underlayer there, which is why I put that fusing, so that it's at least a dark color and not, you know, white and kind of with all the loose hairs all over the show. So yeah, just continuing. Just be strong. If you feel like you need a rush, just slap yourself and go slowly. And waxing the thread is really useful. Can't believe I didn't do that. Suffering the consequences of Benjamin of the past. Yeah, so I'm going to go all the way to the edge. I'm going to have that as the very last stitch, right over there. And I'll just take that straight back. Yeah, perfect. And here I'll just somewhere knock that off, kind of in the background here. Doesn't really matter, as long as you don't have a random loop. All right, so from there, I'm going to stick with my single cotton. Do another knot. I'm going to take all of the basting out. I'm going to come and do a prick stitch, basically just underneath the seam here. What I really want to do there is check, you see here my seam allowance is folded to one side instead of flat, how it should be. So basically just making sure that it's going to remain flat and not end up, you know, folding over to one side and then causing me a little bit of a bubble there. So I'm basically just going to do a back stitch, prick stitch kind of thing. Just touching my finger on the other side and just going along like that. So I can just feel here something is not 1000% exact. Yeah, so I'm just going along, stitching that. When I get to that side, we'll carry on for the next one. So there you can see I did a little prick stitch just next to that seam line on the under collar, and then I gave it a little bit of an iron so everything's nice and flat. And now again I'm just going to go and baste in the exact same way that I've done, I don't know, maybe for the third time now. Just kind of lock this straight line in and then do one row right next to the break or the fall of the collar, and then one row next to that, etc. By now I'm sure you know the story. So I'm going to just baste that and then we'll carry on. So I've done all that basting, and of course I put it on the mannequin for the 5,000th time to just double check that everything is lying and falling nicely. There's no weird puckers or pulls anywhere. And so there's a couple ways to do this. I'll also just showing you my method. What a lot of people do is they will open up here, this portion here, and squeeze this in there and then stitch that by hand. I'm just going to show you the method that I like, which is to start with just going around, again, surprise, surprise, basting stitch, kind of close to the edge of the collar. And once I've done that, I'm going to measure out 1.5 centimeters around and just trim that excess down to 1.5. So you see there, I've trimmed that down to 1.5, and I'm just going to flip this over with a piece of bias binding or a strip of binding here for fashion. So the one thing about that is that here on this portion of the curve, obviously if I flip this in, there's going to be a bit of excess. And here on this portion of the curve, if I flip this in, it's going to be a bit tight. So I'm going to go to the iron, stretch these two portions out, and then here, shrink that portion in a little bit. So there, I'm done with my ironing. And you can kind of lie this as flat as you possibly can, and then just check, how is this all looking. And yeah, I'm going to take this piece of binding and just put it from the right side. And I actually don't want to come past the edge here. I can stay a little bit back from the edge, but I'm going to pin it from there. I'll trim it down in a minute. And I know that this needs to be stretched out, so I'm going to, in a way, stretch it out. Now, bias binding or bias is very flexible, but I do find it quite tough under the machine to really keep the shape that I've just ironed. So I like to put quite a few pins to kind of lock in that shape, even though my bias is going to stretch. The pins will at least guide me as to where my stretch should and shouldn't be. So once I've done that, I'll just pop over to the machine and stitch with 1 foot seam allowance. So it's going to be 4 mils, even, yeah, 5 mils. And here I'm just going to see with my eye where is the edge of the collar and just trim that back, either exactly on the edge or like 1 centimeter back from the edge there. All right, so there I've stitched that, ironed it, obviously up like so, ironed it around, and you can then there stitch in the ditch if you want. I'm going to neglect that because it's all going to be held together. And now I'm really just going to flip it up and stitch it down here. Now here you don't want to be too tight because then when this flips over, this area here becomes too tight. So it's a bit of a gamble between too tight and too loose. But I'm just going to go around and pin that, and then you guessed it, put it on the mannequin, and just make sure that when it is flipped over, it's not too tight anywhere. So yeah, after checking that out on the mannequin, seeing that this is all smoothing over, no funny pulls or bumps anywhere, I'll just come along and stitch this all by hand. So I have in the past, when I was a little bit more obsessed with doing machine stitching, uh, I would kind of measure everything out quite lacquer. This portion here, where it joins there, I would iron it, but not like incredibly sharp. I would, iron it a little bit more round in a way. And then here, I would either, do it like this method or putting the fabric, like this, doing a zigzag there and then flipping it over, or like this, zigzagging and then flipping the fabric like this, and then hand stitching it in here. Which, yeah, I mean, that is totally fine, but I felt that there, I really had to get the measurements quite accurate so that I could fold it over and, then it would join in here quite perfectly, and that created a lot of stress in my life, which I don't like. So, um, yeah, I changed to this method. I also with that one struggled to like get this, the stretch here and the gather here to be accurate. I find it's easier to do that by hand than by machine. So this method that I do, it is quite labor intensive. We're basically doing this entire thing by hand. The only thing we've done by machine is join the upper and the lower collar and join this piece of binding. Everything else has been by hand. But yeah, I mean, it's just my style, it's the way I do it. And it gives me the chance to put this cute piece of binding here at the back of the collar, which is a little bit unique and makes my life a little bit easier. Maybe not time wise, but definitely stress wise. And, the other methods, I spend so much time stressing and measuring and remeasuring that it ends up actually taking me the same amount of time. Whereas this method, although it is quite time consuming, it's much less stressful, so I'm able to kind of still cope with the rest of the business while I'm doing this collar, and I don't go too crazy. So yeah, I'm just going to stitch this all the way to the other end. I won't make you stick around for that. And then we'll finish up. I suppose I could just explain it now. The ends here. So I'll iron that completely flat. And then here, it depends on how much I've got here. Sometimes I fold it just like that, in and in. Sometimes I'll trim that off if it's too much. I think this will actually be, that is maybe a little bit much. I'll trim it maybe down to about 4, so I can fold 2, 2. Then the only interesting thing here is, you try and when you stitch this to, in a way, like pinch that, pulling it back so that when the collar lies flat, this is pulled back. It doesn't end up, you know, um, flapping upwards like that. So use that method to then pull let it curve towards the body. Yeah, let me go and do that. So you see I've stitched all of that by hand. Then here, I just trimmed off I trimmed it to 4, and then I just trimmed some of the seam allowance down and just fold 2 and 2. Now, unfortunately, as you know how it goes, always be checking. It's not your client's job to check your work for you or your boss's job. It's your job. So you see here, remember I cut this down so that the peak of the lapel is showing out there a little bit, which is going to be super fash. But here you see when this is joined, it's kind of glash there. So this just means that when I folded this portion over, see there's still some excess there. So I'm just going to redo that. And just one thing to say here, when you iron, don't iron it flat like this, because then when you pull it over, that line is going to kind of come and sit up here. Have it folded like this and then iron it like that. So I'm just going to redo this section. And then here, I'm just going to hand stitch around, and I have pulled this a little bit back so that it's just curving backwards towards the body. And, you know, everyone is a little bit different. So, you know, I like to just do a little bit of like a stabilizing stitch there, just to keep these two pieces of the collar together, the peak and this upper collar. You don't really have to, you know, I always do it. Sometimes I'll just put like kind of two bars like that. I think that's probably what I'll do in this case. There's lots of different ways, but I like to do it like that. So let me finish that off, and that will then be that. That's my method of doing the collar. As you can see, a little bit of a crazy method. One of those methods that kind of, you know, I always say when I do this, I just tell myself, self, prepare emotionally to do this twice because, whew, this job. But yeah, so here I'm just going to finish off, you know, this last little section. I'm always going to stitch here to see, you know, just kind of finish up that piece of felt. And then here I want to make sure that there's no random little furs or anything like this sticking out. And I'll sometimes, you know, depending on how it's been joined here, sometimes I need like one extra stitch just to join those two together, which I am going to do now. Just give it kind of like a nice solid join. And then yeah, you know, this little like postage stamp there, I'm just going to whip stitch around that, and it is already pinned in a way that pulls it backwards. So that will just pull the whole collar backwards a little bit. So once I've done that, the last thing to do is the most satisfying job of pulling out the basting, and there you're done. I know I keep saying it's the last and then there's 10 other things to do, but really now this is the last, is to, yeah, you know, just join this. I don't like this to be flapping around too much. So I'm going to just do, in this case, I'm just going to, you know, just catch the back also, because I don't want these stitches showing at the front, of course. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different methods. And I think with this one, just going to do kind of 3 like that, and then just knot off there. Maybe I'll just do 2 bar tacks like that. Or if you'd really call it a bar tack. I don't know. Yeah, and this one I need to just squeeze a little bit. So then I'll do one kind of here in the middle. You see here, I'm not going to catch this portion of the peak. I'm going to catch that under portion.